Welcome to a New Mexico PBS Election 2020 special as we sit down with the candidates in the race for the state's 2nd Congressional District. Incumbent and Democrat Xochitl Torres Small and Republican challenger Yvette Herrell. I'm New Mexico in Focus host Gene Grant. This year's election will be a rematch of 2 years ago when Representative Torres Small narrowly beat out Yvette Herrell by less than 4,000 votes. And this race is on many lists as one of the most competitive congressional races in the country. The 2nd Congressional District covers all of southern New Mexico, including Carlsbad, Roswell, and Las Cruces, but it does stretch as far north as Socorro in some places. Now, traditionally, it has leaned Republican. In fact, the only other 2 Democrats to hold the seat were Harold Runnels in the 1970s and 1980s, and Harry Teague in 2008 to 2010. In 2016, the district did vote for President Trump despite electing Torres Small. Historically, it leans about 6% more Republican than the national average. Our goal for the next hour is simple: to learn more about the candidates and their stance on some of the most important issues of the day. The order of our in-depth interviews was decided by a coin flip. We'll begin with the Republican candidate Yvette Herrell. Before running for CD2 in 2018, she served in the state legislature from 2011 to 2018. Yvette Herrell, welcome. New Mexico PBS Studios. Glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. First question, kind of an easy one. What's changed in the last 2 years since you first tried to win this seat?
Gosh, there have been so many changes, not only in the state, but of course nationally because of the pandemic virus. Our campaign also made changes. We have a new team that we brought on right after the 2018 election cycle. Love our team. You can see from our voter contact and the things that we're doing in the campaign this time, very different approach and very successful so far. We're getting good feedback, and really the biggest change I think is having President Trump at the top of the ticket this year versus in the midterm.
Well, certainly you mentioned COVID-19. That's a big change, certainly.
Right.
What's your opinion on how President Trump has handled the pandemic? Could he have done anything differently in your view?
I actually think the administration did a great job with the information they had at the time. Shutting down travel, international travel to China, I think was a great step. And I also believe that passing the CARES package and the president signing it right away was a good step. And what I really appreciated, though, early on, they were having the press conferences, daily, weekly, really informing the American public of what they knew and how they were going to combat it. And I really appreciated the mobilization of getting American companies to start manufacturing medical equipment, respirators, masks, and not a state in the nation went without. And in fact, so much so that we had a surplus and could send overseas and help other nations. So given the information that we had at the time, I think we did a remarkable job. I think the president did, and I believe we, lessons learned. Who could have known what this would have looked like, or how big a virus this would be, and what the costs would be in terms of not only human life but the economy, everything. So I'm sure there are a lot of lessons learned, but I believe they handled it swiftly and really to the best of their ability.
Something a little more current about this. How do you feel about the president in his return from Walter Reed Hospital and being maskless, going back into the White House? Did you have any response to that when you watched that?
I really didn't. I think it was concerning for the country that the president tested positive. I really appreciate that he was able to go in, get the medical treatment necessary, and I think the virus will affect people differently. And it feels as though he gets ridiculed for just about anything he does, but I don't believe there was anybody within his space when he took the mask off. And I think it was really a showing of, we can get through this. I tested positive. I went through some of the medical treatments and did the things the doctors had suggested in terms of taking a few days going to Walter Reed. But I really think it shows strength that we know it's a serious virus, and we know there's a mortality rate attached to it, but we can't let it control our lives or our economies or our livelihoods. And I really didn't have an opinion one way or the other, but certainly not a negative opinion about it.
What do you think about Michelle Lujan Grisham and her handling of the pandemic? As you know, we've had outbreaks in Eddy County and Chavez County, and a lot of pushback about mask wearing. I'm curious about your thoughts about how our governor's handled it.
I've said this several times. Again, we know it's a serious virus, and we know that there's a mortality rate attached to it. And government's role in this case is to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people. But government's role is also to protect the health, safety, and welfare of our economy. And in my opinion, I believe that the local governments should have more power, more control, and more decision making. I don't really feel it's a one-size-fits-all. And as I travel around the district, you know, what works for Santa Fe may not be the right fit for Jow or Hagerman or Hatch. And I really think that the local governments and the people in those communities should have more of a voice at the table, because what we've seen is, you know, a picking of, if you will, winners and losers in terms of stores that remained open, churches, those types of things. And it's been a disadvantage to our small business owners who've been closed or were closed for several weeks or months. While we saw, you know, the Walmarts or the big box stores remain open. So I really feel that there could have been better handling and allowing local governments to make better decisions for their communities and counties.
Speaking of sort of a personal responsibility issue, you have your mask.
Yeah.
Walked in the studio, your staff has masks as well. Do you feel that masks are an effective way to beat back the pandemic, or are you just following orders, so to speak?
Normally I'm following orders.
Okay.
I think there's been a lot of misinformation on whether the masks work. I mean, we've heard Dr. Fauci say the masks don't work. They do. I think the misinformation, but I'm very respectful. So if I walk into a business that's going to mandate it, I will wear them. You know, when I have events, I ask people to, if they're comfortable, wear a mask. If they don't, you know, but I do want to respect others and respect business owners. And so for me, it's more of a respect issue.
Gotcha. In the primary, you ran an ad saying that Democrats had, quote, took the 2018 race from you, and that 8,000 absentee ballots appeared. Those ballots didn't appear, as we know now. They had just not been tabulated,
Right.
and as you know, they were hand counted in public the next day. You didn't challenge the election results, nor did you audit. The audit that you paid for didn't show there were enough question marks to have it handed to you in the race. Why call into question how that was tabulated? I'm curious where your feelings are now about that.
Yeah, no, I am really glad that we did the audit, if you will. We challenged the court and impounded all the absentee ballots. And through that process, it was revealed, you know, we saw over 700 ballots that were actually date and time stamped, received the day after the election was over. So that calls into question the integrity of the process. We also saw thousands of ballots that did not have the required information, such as an year of birth or a signature. And so what was going on at the time is people were very disgusted and very confused, as well was I. And I said on the Judge Janine show, you know, our job here is to instill voter confidence. But the report was very revealing and did show the irregularities in the system.
I'm curious why you didn't challenge.
Well,
700 is a lot of votes.
It is a lot of votes, but at the time we didn't challenge for a recount because there is a margin set. So if the difference in the number of votes falls within a certain margin, then there's an automatic recount. The reason we didn't challenge it in court, if we would have had the funds available to impound the absentee ballots throughout the entire district, we could have been having a very different conversation right now, but we only looked at Doñana County because at the time that's where the glaring red flag was for our campaign. And our attorney said in the report, you know, had we been able to impound throughout the district, we may have seen a very different outcome in terms of challenging on the federal level. But really what we needed to do was find out what the crux of the problem. We saw in our report a lot of ballot harvesting in Doñana County, which is illegal in the state of New Mexico. I am proud of the team, what they did, but we also have to look at the bigger picture and know we would be facing, you know, a Democratic governor, Democratic Secretary of State, Democratic Attorney General, Democratic District Attorney. You know, how far could it have gotten? And at some point in time, when you draw the line and say, you know what, we have good information that we can utilize to help educate the public, and then move forward to ensure that all eyes, you know, are paying attention to future elections, not just statewide, but of course nationwide.
Gotcha. Let's get to your district a little bit
Sure.
here. You said Congresswoman Torres Small will ban fracking, if I'm hearing you correctly. She's on the record, however, saying that such a move would severely threaten school funding and things.
Right.
And NMOGA, New Mexico Oil and Gas Association, has credited her with being an energy advocate. Those two things don't quite go together.
Yeah.
How do you square those two things?
Yeah, I just looked to the voting record.
Okay.
She voted in favor of allowing future presidents to ban fracking. Joe Biden the other night on the debate very clearly stated his concern about our energy, our extractive industry. And, you know, he right away said that the first thing he would do in office is rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, which my opponent did vote in favor of doing so. I do think that the voting record speaks very different from, you know, just comments. And when you look to see that, yes, she voted in favor of the future president's banning fracking, she voted in favor of rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, that really is not conducive to the industry, and it really will be costly to New Mexico jobs and to the New Mexico industry. So I think there's actions are speaking louder than words, and we point to voting records in this case.
Right. On that same note, you kind of anticipated a little bit there on fossil fuel production is climate change, certainly.
Sure.
One of the most severe impacts of climate change in CD2 specifically is extreme heat. It's already starting. We've already seen reports that many parts of CD2 down the road will have some real problems with heat, and elderly folks are vulnerable. What measures would you exact, or what steps can you take as a congressperson to ensure folks in your district that they'll be safe?
Yeah, and you know what? The thing that's great about this is innovation, industry, science, technology. We're seeing the industry as a whole really utilize new technologies to leave a smaller carbon footprint, to build a cleaner industry in saving the environment. And look, prior to COVID-19 pandemic, we had the highest production levels that we've seen in New Mexico in many, many years, and yet the lowest emissions. So we can really see that by utilizing new technologies, by innovation, industry leaders are doing really, I think, a superb job in cleaning up the industry and making it safe for our environment. No one in the district, no one in the state or the nation wants to damage our air or water, you know, our environment. And I think when you have an industry as important as the oil and gas industry and can see that we're making huge steps in the right direction to have an industry that's so reliable and yet done in a cleaner fashion, I think it's fantastic. And certainly the health and safety of the public is at the forefront for these developments. So I'm very proud of the steps they've taken and how they've been able to innovate in the industry as a whole.
What's your opinion on the Holtec storage facility? As you know, that'll be a surface level containment location to store spent nuclear rods and such. What's your position there?
Yeah, it's a very interesting conversation, and I know that's been we've had dialogue over that over the last 2 or 3 years for sure. Really, what we have to make sure of safety first. We have to make sure that the nuclear commissions are able to review, regulate, and ensure the complete safety of it. But the decision for the storage facility, I believe, should be made at the local level with those that live in and around and would be most affected by such a storage facility. Naturally, people look to the southeastern corner of the state because we have the WIPP facility there as well. But in Holtec's case, I think what we need to do is make sure that individual property owners, community leaders, you know, those, again, that would be most affected have a voice at the table and let the communities decide for themselves rather than government decide for them.
Is it possible, however, that the southeastern part of our state, or CD2 in specific, could end up being sort of a repository dump, as folks like to say, for certain things? Balance that with jobs? Is that a fair trade for you, and can we manage that?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and people have said that. I've heard it both ways as I've traveled the district. On one hand, people are very receptive to it. Again, Holtec would just be another kind of break in the path, if you will, as it relates to the storage, because we have WIPP facility down there. But on the other side of the coin, we have people that are very much concerned about property values, about any kind of unseen catastrophe that could happen if one of the spent casings crack, what it would do to our groundwater. These are the kind of things that are real concerns that people have. So I've certainly seen it both sides, and that's why I do believe that it's just imperative that government step back a little bit and let the local communities and the people that live in around those areas make those decisions, because it's not really fair for those that don't live there to be forcing an issue one way or the other. But we have to take into consideration all of the concerns and come to an agreement that works for everybody.
Another big issue, of course, for the district is immigration.
Yeah.
You support the wall that President Trump
Yes.
is building. Do we have evidence yet that you've been able to see that it's impactful on stopping either illegal drug trade, undocumented folks coming through. What's the upshot as you see it locally of the wall?
Right. Well, the great thing is it's a promise made, promise kept by the administration. They have been able to build over, I believe it's over 260 miles now of it, of the wall. And I have been, yes, like you say, a proponent for it. And we have seen the slowdown in illegal crossings. However, we need to do more on the federal level to ensure that we take care of business. And when I say that, I mean, let's reform the immigration policy so those that are wanting to come to the country legally can do so without waiting for years and paying thousands and thousands of dollars. On the other side of that, it's a national security issue. We need to do what we can to stop the drug smuggling, the human trafficking. That is a big deal and still a big deal. And I know that the wall is helping, but we also need to equip and ensure that we have the men and women on the ground to do their jobs and equip them with the necessary tools. But I am a huge proponent of securing the border, securing New Mexico, securing the nation,
Sure.
and working to finish the wall, and then ensuring that we have the tools necessary and the funding available for those tools. And we've got a lot of work to do, and especially on our reforms for immigration. We've seen Congress for decades kind of kick the can down the road, and we need to really take the bull by the horns and make some quick changes that are good changes.
Right.
And then get these lines at the border stopped so that we can make available the path to citizenship without having to wait so long. And then, quite honestly, quit giving handouts to those that are coming here illegally, taking away from tax-paying citizens. So we've got our work to do on the border, that's for sure.
I'm just curious, have you seen any numbers about the decreases in any of those things you mentioned? I haven't
not
personally,
one that
but-
I want to
Okay.
speak to, but I have heard, and we have been in contact with several of the agencies down near the border and on the border,
Okay.
and we know that the number is lowering.
Okay.
We also know that the Mexico stepped up to the plate and did help in keeping people from coming across the southern border. So I don't have a specific number just to, just to give you, but yeah. But we know from reports that we've seen that it is working, and it's just common sense that obviously the border wall would be pushing people to the sides, and so it's a much easier job, but it's not an easy job
Sure.
overall. We've still got a lot of work to do.
Your opponent has made the fact that she would like to see more technology used at the border, and as if you happen to win the seat, you'd be very impactful as a representative in that district to make that happen. Are we spending enough on the tech side at the wall? So far, it's just the slats and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But folks say we could be spending a lot more money more efficiently and have better results if we use more technology.
It's possible, and I want to ensure that the funding is made available for these
Okay.
kind of upgrades in this technology. And Congressman Hurd introduced the Smart Wall Act, and I know Congressman Steve Pierce had signed on to it, where it was introducing the use of drones or high technology equipment. The status of that bill, I do not know, but again, just giving our agents and our Border Patrol men and women the tools that they need, I'm all for it, and I think that we need to ensure that the funding's available so that they can do their jobs, do them safely for themselves, but protect our American soil.
Right. In the bigger picture, are there any immigration reforms off the top of your head that you support?
Well,
or that you would try to implement if you win the seat?
For sure. I mean, what we need to be looking at is how do we get a pathway to citizenship for our DACA folks,
Okay.
and do that in a way that's through a reform process, but where we can give them that access to the citizenship status. But somehow we are not taking this as a serious issue, and it's been decades long. I mean, DACA, some of these people have been here for 10 and 20 and 30 years. We also need to ensure that the judges on the bench, there are adequate number of them. The wait times are just too long. And I think we're doing a disservice by not looking strongly at our immigration policies to allow the workforce that our farmers and ranchers need to be in this country working legally, to help them with production and helping them with their crops. It's a year-round thing, producing food for the country and for the world. So, there are so many things we could be looking at to enhance immigration policies, and we just haven't seen much out of D.C., and it's unfortunate because it is a big issue that we continue to talk about every single year.
Do you support the Trump administration's efforts to roll back the Affordable Care Act?
I do. I actually do, because for me, the Affordable Care Act for many people was anything but affordable. We saw our premiums go up. Mine did. as an individual, and I know that this administration has rolled back the personal mandate, which is very helpful. But I firmly believe in free markets. We need to protect our pre-existing conditions. I've had that all over my website, but we need to bring more transparency into the picture. And when we open up free markets and have insurance companies competing for our business, it drives the cost down. This is better for our individual families, for our businesses, and I do appreciate the executive order that President Trump signed to lower the cost of prescription drugs such as insulin. And now these are things that we as a congressional body need to take to the next level and codify into law. But there are so many expenses for the small business owner and for the individual families today. So I am certainly in favor of making the changes that are affordable to the American people.
I'm curious about police reform and your position on it. As you know, there's been a lot of noise out there across the country to have resources changed and have different things. Let's kind of chop at this. Do you think officers should be required to wear body cameras?
It's a great question, and of course we saw that happen on the state level during the special session. The problem with that particular bill is it happened during a special session with no police officers, with none of their organizations able to be in the committee hearings to give their opinion one way or the other. But what that turns out being is an unfunded mandate, and there are communities such as Otero County who don't have that kind of money in their budgets to pay for those mandatory body cams. So I'm not opposed to it. What I'm opposed to is placing an unfunded mandate on already very short-staffed and underfunded department. So we need to be doing more. We need to be talking about defending the police, not defunding them, and ensure that the tools are available for them for training and for other resources.
Do you think we need to reform qualified immunity for officers?
I think we need to be careful about putting any more risk on the officer's back, and especially when we start looking at personal liability. I think our best bet there would be to, number one, let's be having honest conversations with our, with our departments of corrections, with our sheriff's departments, with our local law enforcement, our state law enforcement, because, here we have a group of men and women that put their lives literally on the line every day to protect our safety, and it feels as though we're chipping away at any protection that they have, and so we need to be very careful about messing around with the qualified immunity. I'm in favor of making sure that we're protecting our police officers on every level, including liability.
Sure. Let's talk about Cowboys for Trump and their leader, Otero County Commissioner Couy Griffin. I'm sure you know. He's one of your strongest supporters. He's also had a history of inflammatory or racist remarks like black NFL players who kneel during the national anthem should go back to Africa, or, quote, the only good Democrat is a dead Democrat, end quote. He does frequently backtrack on after getting attention, saying he's just speaking metaphorically. But the Mescalero Apache tribe, as you know, banned him from tribal land after he posted videos that the tribe said were insensitive and demeaning. Yeah. Why is this an endorsement you value? And also, he's one of the most high-profile, as one of the most high-profile Republicans in the state, certainly. Do you have a responsibility to do more than just distance yourself from that kind of rhetoric?
Yeah, in Cowboys for Trump, one thing we have to remember is the organization as a whole is made up of some just amazing men and women, not only in the state but nationally. It's a good group of patriots. And while, yes, they did endorse me during the primary, I really can't be responsible for what Couy Griffin says or does, no more than he's responsible for what I say or do. It doesn't mean I agree with things that he says or the way he says anything.
Are you prepared to denounce what he's saying?
Well, I do denounce. I don't agree with what he has said, especially some of the comments that have come out. But again, I can't be responsible for what Couy chooses to say or do or where he goes. But I don't want us to get so far into that we overlook the really good men and women, the patriots that are really pushing the American message forward of, pro-life, pro-God, pro-gun. I really appreciate that, and I know sometimes that it kind of comes under the shadow of what Couy Griffin may say or do sometimes, but at the end of the day, we have to look at the organization as a whole, and you can't hold one person responsible for what anybody says, but I do hear what you're saying, and I do appreciate the men and women, though, that believe in liberty and freedom that are a part of the organization, for sure.
Gotcha. How should New Mexico solve its rural broadband problem? This is certainly a CD2 issue,
Yeah.
without doubt. Can you point to a broadband expansion project you might have heard about in a rural part of any part of our country that would excite you, that you think could be possible for CD2 as well?
Well, actually, that's a great comment, and it's rural broadband and fiber optics is something that we've talked about, not you and I, but we've talked about on the state level for the whole time that I served. Really exciting news, though, is that there is rural broadband changes coming. I know they are looking at 17 different counties that will receive some help in doing that, and that is coming from the federal level, from the organization there. And I was actually really lucky to be on some of the calls early on to see where they were looking at. Acoma Pueblo was one of them. I know they were going to be receiving some of the help, some of the border communities right down on the southern border. So it's coming, and that's been just one of the larger challenges. And I think we're finally getting the message across that, we've got to be able to provide these services to people regardless of where they live and how remote that area is, because it's a disservice. Even right now, looking at the big picture in terms of education, when we're looking at trying to educate our kids through an online system, and we have children in our entire state that don't have access to broadband in the 21st century, the way it just doesn't make sense that we could actually have anybody living without it. So we know great progress is already being made, and that would obviously be a priority, because it's not just for the school children, it's for the rural communities, health, safety. Ag operations use the broadband, so it's something that I think that we can certainly be doing better at, but we see now there are some progress steps being made from the Broadcast Association.
All right. You certainly support the Second Amendment, there's no doubt there.
Yes.
Is there such thing as sensible gun control in your view?
The sensible gun control to me is our Second Amendment, the right to own and bear arms. There are already laws on the books that we should be following, but to impede on our Second Amendment in any way, I don't support any legislation that would do that. And I'm proud of my voting record on the state level, and the endorsements of not only the NRA, but Gun Owners of America, and an A rating from New Mexico 2A Women. So a huge advocate of a Second Amendment.
That includes types of weapons, ammunition?
Right.
Okay.
And you might have seen the questionnaire, some of the questionnaires that come out, to ban, say, like automatic weapons or certain magazines. No, I would not support anything in that way.
In 2001, Presidents Bush, Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump have used the authorization for use of military force to justify a myriad of military actions. That authorization, as you know, was designed to respond to 9/11, meaning there are now men and women serving who weren't even born when that was passed, which is kind of interesting. Should Congress end that authorization, and what's your reasoning if yes or no?
No, I actually don't think they should, because we live in a time now, a world now that, there's just too many unknowns. I think that's where we have to have some trust and some belief in our government and who the people are that are making the decisions for us on every level of government. But we need to keep the authorization in place, is my opinion. I think for the health and safety, and certainly for our international security. So I'm in favor of leaving it.
Our last question.
Okay.
Got about a minute left here. Who is a member of Congress you admire, and what about them would you like to emulate?
I admire very much so Congressman Jim Jordan. I love his tenacity, his grit, his ability to really bring his message home. I love that he stands for what he believes in. He says what he means what he says, and he's just has become a dear friend, and I really have a high regard for him, and really want to work with him in Congress. I've been blessed to be kind of mentored by him over the last several years, and I just appreciate somebody who believes in our country and our Constitution the way he does, and fights for it tirelessly every day. So he would absolutely be somebody I can't wait to work side by side with in Washington, D.C.
Yvette Herrold, thank you for making the trip up. We really appreciate it.
I thank you for having me. This is fantastic.
Absolutely. Our pleasure.
Thank you.
Good luck.
Thanks.
Yvette Herrold will be squaring off with a familiar opponent at the polls. As we mentioned, she lost by a narrow margin to Xochitl Torres Small just 2 years ago. Torres Small has worked as a water attorney, federal law clerk, and served as a field representative for Senator Tom Udall, who's retiring at the end of his current term. Representative Xochitl Torres Small, thank you for doing this for New Mexico PBS. We appreciate your time.
Dean, thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. First question, what has changed about your district since you won 2 years ago?
Well, it continues to be an incredibly large and diverse district, and we continue to struggle with challenges that have really been exacerbated by COVID-19. So when it comes to the challenges that rural hospitals and clinics were already facing, it's gotten even more severe currently. And when it comes to the economic challenges and finding a good job, the impact that we've seen in this dual crisis of both healthcare and economy has certainly caused dramatic impact, especially in southeastern New Mexico, for example.
Your seat in Congress is certainly one of the country's most vulnerable. Don't have to tell you that. Keeping it is no small task either. Don't have to tell you that as well. But in trying to do that, are you backing off stances you'd otherwise take in hope of pleasing enough people to stay in Congress?
My goal in serving and representing this district is making sure that I'm representing everyone. And that's a difficult task, especially in these increasingly divided times. That's why I spend as much time as possible getting to listen to and learn from the people that I serve. And I was proud in 2019 to be rated as the 5th most accessible freshman member of Congress. I was also rated as the 9th most effective freshman member of Congress. So I'm continuing to work hard to serve this district. And representation is difficult in such a diverse district, but that's what I signed up for. And I think, when you get the chance to learn 6 different sides of the same issue by talking to people in the district who experience it in different ways, we build better and stronger solutions as a result of that. And so that's what I work to do every day in Congress in order to hopefully be able to continue and serve this district.
One thing that's certainly changed is COVID-19 is now a part of our lives as opposed to when you first came to office. What is your opinion of how President Trump has handled the pandemic? How could he have done better, if anything?
Right now, we really need to get to another COVID-19 package. And it's deeply frustrating that all sides appear to have left the table and have stopped negotiating, even when we've been able to show in the House of Representatives that we can find bipartisan solutions. I was really proud to be part of the Problem Solvers proposal, 25 Democrats, 25 Republicans, who the first time negotiations broke down, got back together and said, what common ground can we look at, can we focus on? And it included a wide range of things, including state, local, and tribal funds. I fought specifically for inclusion of that tribal piece. It also included unemployment and extension of unemployment benefits at a slightly reduced amount that could then be scaled based on what people were paid before the before the pandemic. And then also it included robust investments in education, whether there was a hybrid system or whether it was virtual or in person, instead of trying to influence. Now, as we look at the national approach to COVID-19, I've certainly experienced from the New Mexico side the challenges when it comes to getting the PPE and good, reliable testing results that happen quick enough so we can identify hotspots. And as we work in New Mexico to have a regional response, a fundamental piece of that is making sure that we have the testing capacity to identify those hotspots quickly. And I think that the national government could have done more to make sure to provide a national strategy for that testing, for PPE and medical equipment. And also, once a safe vaccine that has been approved scientifically is available, there needs to be a national strategy for that as well, so that less populous states like New Mexico aren't competing against more populous states like California or New York for the crucial tools to fight this virus.
I'm curious if you think companies that received millions of dollars in pandemic relief should show how they spent the money. Would you agree with that?
I do think we need robust oversight. There is a balance between getting the money to good use to make sure that it gets out to reach the people and make a difference. But then we also have to ensure that there's oversight. And one of the examples of that was the PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, that went out to smaller businesses. But we saw in the first wave that it really did not reach those mom and pop shops, especially in New Mexico, that were competing against better resourced, publicly traded companies, for example, that already had much stronger relationships with the larger big banks. And so it wasn't until that second wave that we were able to get set-asides for the community lenders and really work to get more support to the smallest of those businesses. So as we look at how some of those larger loans were distributed, I think there does need to be appropriate oversight to make sure that it all was used according to plan.
Interestingly, how do you feel about the president returning to the White House maskless and doing that little photo op and all that? How did that strike you when you saw that on the news?
You know, one of the tragedies of COVID-19 for me has been seeing how the division of between Republicans and Democrats has exacerbated the spread of the virus, that it's become a political statement rather than a statement of personal responsibility, that we can all use the best social distancing measures as well as masks. And so that's why I think it is a matter of personal responsibility, but people have the opportunity to really show that we care about our neighbors and that we are dedicated to defeating this by setting a good example.
You know, interesting to hear you say personal responsibility. I talk to a lot of folks in your district, and you hear that term a lot when it comes to mask use. What's your opinion about masks? Do you use them? Do you feel it's appropriate to use them? Do you think it's a personal responsibility issue? What's your opinion on masks?
I think it's very appropriate to use them. And early on, I questioned the FEMA administrator, as well as individuals in Homeland Security, about why it wasn't required when you were going through the TSA checkpoint, because people who were still having to get places, some were wearing masks and some weren't, and yet people still had to wait in line. So one person's decision was impacting other people's safety. I think there are times like that where it really does make sense that we follow the best practices. And, I have to admit the competitive streak in me is a pretty heartbroken that, there are other countries that have fewer resources, certainly aren't global powers in the same way we are, but we're able to present a more united front against this virus and more effectively combat it. We've got to find, it shows how divided we are, we've got to find ways to work together to address this.
Your last go-round in 2018 was a pretty close race, had a pretty dramatic lead change, as a matter of fact, in the proceedings. Do you expect this vote count to stretch into the next day or even longer? Are you anticipating that as a candidate?
I anticipate it taking as long as it needs to make sure that everyone's vote is counted. And that really should be the expectation nationally as well as in New Mexico. We have a very safe voting system in New Mexico. Having paper ballots, whether it's voting by absentee or in person, that paper ballot allows us to go back and check and recheck as necessary to make sure that all of the votes are counted. That's actually what happened last time before I was declared the winner and sworn in. They checked those ballots. And so it is really important that we honor that system, that we make sure that no one is left out of that process, and that we take the time necessary to get it right. I'm also know how important it is that everyone engage in our democracy, and I think it's very clear how important it is to vote these days.
If there are challenges to the vote count, will you accept those results of those challenges?
I want to make sure that everyone's voice is heard, everyone's vote is counted. And so that's what we will ensure that we follow the correct process, the appropriate process to do that. Okay. Now, I want to make sure too that once that process is made, it is honored. We did not certainly have that experience last time. And so again, there is a process, there's an appropriate way to challenge a result. And once that process is determined, those results should be honored.
You've been a bit of a hard candidate to track down for an interview, let alone a debate. If you win re-election, would you pledge to take part in at least 3 broadcast debates?
Well, I was proud to have offered to debate last time. I offered in multiple forums and multiple occasions, and unfortunately my opponent was not willing to debate me in 2018. Now as an incumbent that had changed, but so that's why I'm proud that we've already had 2 debates this year. I also worked to try to get us into a forum with the El Paso media market and on a Spanish television station to make sure we were reaching all voters. But I am pleased that we're able to at least have this forum.
Another question on climate change. I want to get into this a little bit. What do you tell people who worry about climate change When they ask why the New Mexico Oil and Gas Association has hailed you as an advocate, how do you square those two things?
Well, I know that we are facing climate change, and people I talk to every single day see its effects right now, whether it's farmers who are grappling with less and less water each year, especially as we enter a La Nina year, which will only make the water scarcity worse, as we see fires all across the country that are hotter and larger than before, right. And as we continue to face increasing temperatures, this is now a reality. And in confronting this reality, we have to work together to address it. We have to make sure that it's not every time the pendulum swings back and forth, there's a new set of plans, but rather that we are moving forward with solutions that work where we have people on board. Mm-hmm. And that's why one of my early votes was voting to re-enter the Paris Climate Change Accord, because I know that it's crucial that we identify the challenges, the carbon outputs that happen here, but also that we stop perpetual polluters like China. This is something that will take action from everyone. That's also why I co-sponsored the Use It Act, which includes investments in things like carbon capture sequestration, and why I know that we have to find better ways to capture methane leaks and also recycle produced water as we look for ways to deal with increased water scarcity. Mm-hmm. But in order to take on this long-standing challenge, we will have to have a committed way forward, which means having people to the table.
On that note, actually, is there a way to transition away from fracking, and should we?
You know, I think that fracking is somewhat misunderstood. We have to make sure that we have responsible oil and gas production, and that's why I talk about the methane leaks. That's why I talk about what you do with the produced water. That's why I talk about, if you look at the gas production that has occurred in southeastern New Mexico, it's been responsible for some of the largest reductions in carbon output thus far. So there are ways that we can identify how to reduce our carbon output and move forward to continue to make progress in diversifying our energy portfolio. That's also going to take investments in wind and solar. That's going to take investments in transmission so that as we create energy in new places across New Mexico, we're able to get that energy to a market. And it's going to take investments in storage, because as we identify we're creating new energy from different places, we have to make sure that that energy is available when we use it, whether it's a peak hour at night or within across seasons of a year. But these are all fundamental pieces of the solution, and New Mexico does need to diversify its energy economy and continue to be a net energy exporter.
Mm-hmm. As you know, extreme heat is one of the issues for CD2 when it comes to climate change, there's no doubt. There's been some studies lately. In fact, the National Academy of Sciences says many homes in the district are unsafe for the elderly and the most vulnerable. As a member of Congress, how do you chop away at this? What specifically for your district, what measures can you enact, or what steps can you take to help mitigate this for your constituents?
We have to invest in technology to continue to advance ways to decrease our carbon output. That means, as I said, investing in transmission and storage as we continue to support advancements in solar and wind. People talk about southeastern New Mexico and the oil and gas production that occurs there, but it also has some of the largest wind and solar production in the state. So we have to continue to invest in these diverse resources. We have to find other ways to capture carbon that's already been emitted. The best science shows that will be a crucial part of the solution no matter what. And so carbon capture sequestration is a good way to help take on these challenges. Mm-hmm. I also think we have to look at how do we make sure we have the best housing, the most, conservation is a piece of this too, in terms of using energy wisely and making sure that the housing market follows those trends as well.
Mm-hmm. The governor of our state, she's a Democrat, and the Republican governor of Texas, they have both say a proposed nuclear waste site for spent fuel rods in your district is a bad idea. Oil and gas companies have opposed it. Environmentalists have opposed it, certainly. Why are you still undecided on this issue?
There are still significant scientific reviews that have to occur. And so when I say that I trust science, I mean it. I'm asking all of the questions. I'm talking to the scientists to review it because I am not, I don't have the expertise of being a nuclear physicist. So I'm looking at what that review looks like and making sure that it includes all the things that I can think of and that other experts are thinking of. So, they're analyzing the site, but they're analyzing it for a certain period of time. Now, that's important, but there's also a policy aspect of that. What happens? Where does it go after that? What is the permanent solution? And that's something that Congress needs to work to identify, because it's not okay if New Mexico gets saddled with an additional responsibility without another solution. Also, working to make sure that we're evaluating the transportation. There hasn't been a public process to consider the transportation of the nuclear material, and so that's another piece that needs to be thoroughly and scientifically reviewed. And also making sure that we do take on this nationally, we do have to solve this problem. Where this nuclear waste will be stored is a national problem. It is threatening waterways. It is something that we have not been able to resolve through Yucca Mountain, for example. And so making sure that we are moving towards a permanent solution is crucial as nationally. At the same time, we've got to protect our New Mexican resources, and we've got to address past mistakes. That's why I was an original co-sponsor of RECA legislation to expand coverage for uranium miners in the northwestern part of my district, and to include a national apology for the health impacts that they have had, because we know the impacts of nuclear waste and energy in the district. The first atomic bomb was detonated in the district that I serve, so we have some expertise in the area, but we also want to make sure that we aren't dealt an unfair legacy. The only way to square those is to truly look at the science and to make sure that we are working towards a permanent solution as we identify the interim risks that we are undertaking.
Do you anticipate having that science give you a firm answer before the election? I mean, I'm not saying you're hedging here until after the election, but it feels like it's close when I hear you talk about this.
The EIS for the storage of the site has already been released, but I do not feel like there's been enough review of the transportation. There isn't a transportation route, for example, that's been identified. Okay. So there's still significant review that needs to occur.
Gotcha. Let's talk about immigration, another big for your district, certainly. How do you feel about the president's child separation policy?
This should never have happened. And as I talk to people across the district, I think we know, growing up along the border, that we can be a nation of laws as well as a nation of values. We know that to fix our broken immigration system and border security challenges, we have to do so much more than slogans or take on issues without feeling of who we are morally. And that's why I worked hard to make sure that whether it was children who died in our care at Border Patrol stations or others who've been separated, that we are investigating those instances. I know that we have to continue to monitor those challenges, although as a policy it has thankfully mostly been stopped. But we are still facing challenges that the Obama administration faced before the Trump administration faced when it comes to unaccompanied minors and what happens when they present at the border. And that's why it's going to take making sure that we have the right resources at the border, making sure that we have we fix our broken immigration system, and that includes getting more judges to review asylum cases so that those decisions can be made more quickly, and stronger cooperation with neighboring and nearby countries to invest in resources, making sure that we are identifying the root causes of this migration and working to change that tide.
Mm-hmm. I got a curious question for you. Have you met the president? And I ask that under the idea of how do you feel about him? I'm curious to your thoughts about him as a person.
I have met the president once and been in the same place as him twice. The first was for a national prayer breakfast. I was reading from John about the importance of loving your neighbor. And the second one was during the signing of peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. And those are two very different examples of President Trump. You know, I do think that the path towards peace between Israel and the United Arab Emirates is a significant milestone. It has been decades since there has been a similar peace agreement, and I think that's something that's worth noting. And you know, with the National Prayer Breakfast, I was really inspired by Arthur Brooks, who spoke at the conference about the importance of finding ways to love your enemies and engaging in robust discourse, finding ways that even when you disagree, to learn from each other. It prompted me to actually go and read his book. And you know, I was disappointed that the president was not more engaged in that message. And so there are things that we will disagree with. But what I've said before is that when you're willing to work with anyone to deliver, that means you show them the respect of holding them accountable when you disagree with them. It also means you put those differences aside to get things done. And that's what I've done with this president, and that's what I'll do in the future.
Let's talk about DACA, another big program for your district, certainly. The Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration in its DACA challenge, as you know, and a federal judge has said the administration needs to accept new applications for the existing program. President Trump is currently ignoring those court decisions. Is he right to do that? Why or why not?
You know, I'm incredibly frustrated with the slow movement that it's taken to try to get Dreamers a pathway to citizenship. Kids who were brought to this country, it's the only country they know. They were brought through no fault of their own. And that's why I'm an original co-sponsor of the Dream and Promise Act, legislation that passed bipartisan in the House of Representatives. When I worked for Senator Udall in 2009, we were working on this legislation then. And even then, it was not getting passed. So we do need a legislative solution. And the increased uncertainty that these kids, these folks who we've invested resources, they are ready to start supporting our economy. When you talk about essential workers, so many of them are in the healthcare industry. They are crucial for kind of our future economic opportunities, and that they're kind of in limbo right now. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help our economy, and it doesn't help our communities. So I hope that we can get to a resolution on this. Unfortunately, that legislation that I co-sponsored that passed bipartisan in the House is just waiting in the Senate because they've refused to act, just like they've refused to act on another COVID-19 package. And that's why we have to be willing to work together to forge these solutions.
Gotcha. We're under 5 minutes. We're getting there, almost at time. Since 2001, Presidents Bush, Obama, and Trump have used the authorization for use of military force to justify a myriad of military actions. That authorization, of course, was designed in response to 9/11. Meaning there are now men and women serving who weren't even born when it was passed, interestingly. Should Congress end that authorization, and what's your reasoning, if so?
So I have voted in last year in the National Defense Authorization Act to limit that authorization of military use of military force because I do think Congress does have a role when it comes to identifying how funds are used in a war and when it comes to the ability to declare war. Now, that being said, we continue to face challenges when it comes to combating Iran. And so we have to make sure that we have a well-tailored use of force to replace that. But this overbroad, expansive use of force is not the solution to that.
I got another question, very local question for you. You'll understand why. It's inspired by the president's Proud Boys moment, I'll call it, and hit by Cowboys for Trump leader, Otero County Commissioner Couy Griffin. As a congresswoman, you're one of the most important voices in New Mexico's Democratic Party. If one of your strongest supporters makes a racist or inflammatory statement, do you have a responsibility to speak out about it?
You know, I have spoken out against Commissioner Griffin. I have tried to work with him in the past, but when you work with someone who then later turns around and says the only good Democrat is a dead Democrat, you have to acknowledge that is just is not serving anyone. It is dangerous, and I have.
Would you call on the other party leaders to do so?
I think it's important that people recognize when there are statements that are tearing our communities apart.
Is there? Let me ask you another question about broadband. Actually, Have there been any ways that you've seen rural programs that have been effective in curing the rural broadband problem? It's a big issue for CD2, certainly.
We've had incredible challenges when it comes to good, reliable internet. This is something I have been working on since even before COVID-19, working to make sure that we even have an accurate depiction of where the need is by having real maps that reflect the need in rural areas. So, for example, right now, some of the programs that allocate funds make decisions based on maps that don't identify the needs in rural areas because they're based on census block, which are larger depending on how rural a population is. And if just one building has access to good, reliable internet in that census block, the entire census block is counted as having that same internet service. And as you know, in areas across New Mexico, that just isn't the case. So I worked to get that included in legislation that was recently passed by the House of Representatives in our infrastructure package, which included $100 billion in investments for good, reliable internet. You know, our country stood up when we needed to make investments across the country, whether it was electricity or water or highways. And it's time now that we do the same thing when it comes to good, reliable internet.
So our last question, who is a member of Congress that you admire, and what is it about them that you'd like to emulate?
I will say one that I've learned a lot from recently is Dusty Johnson. He is one of just 4 members of Congress who represents a district more rural than mine. He's a Republican out of South Dakota.
Right.
And what I really enjoy about him is that he is humble and earnest and hardworking. When there's 435 members of Congress and there's often a lot of folks trying to get the limelight, he's not one of them. He's just willing to do a lot of the work. He was one of the key folks who helped build this Problem Solvers COVID-19 package because he just sat in a room and said, let's look at where we can agree. I think that's a great example, and I really enjoy learning from him. We both serve on the House Ag Committee, and it's wonderful to get to, we work together to introduce the Farming Support to States Act, to use some of the COVID-19 relief fund, sending it to states to identify farming challenges, because each agricultural industry throughout the country is really varied by region. And so getting more money to deliver directly through states would help address some of the unique supply chain challenges, for example. So I really enjoy working with Dusty Johnson.
Good deal. Representative Torres Small, thank you very much for your time. We know you're having a busy day. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Dean.
You got
Take
it.
care. Bye-bye.
We thank you for watching this Election 2020 special, a conversation with the candidates for the 2nd Congressional District. We invite you to tune in a week from today, Sunday, October 18th, as we host a debate with the candidates in the U.S. Senate race, and a reminder to follow all of our election coverage at newmexicoinfocus.org. You can also keep up on all the national news with the PBS NewsHour. Just head to nmpbs.org. Early in-person voting starts on October 17th here in New Mexico. Absentee voting began this past Tuesday, but you can still apply for an absentee ballot up until October 20th. We encourage you to vote and to be as safe as possible while you're making your voice heard at the polls.